US industry and production of military hardware was perhaps the most decisive factor in US helping win World War II. Aircraft production in particular was massive, outstripping all other nations, and the number of planes produced towered over numbers of armored vehicles made, for example. Indeed, even back then it was clear aircraft were crucial to winning a war. Today, the ability to quickly produce massive numbers of planes might be important again, if it ever comes to another world war. But could the US industrial base rise to such a challenge? How many military planes could the US make per year once it ramps up? And how long might it take to get there? Before we go industrial, let's plant some trees. That's possible by courtesy of our sponsor, Established Titles. From now on, call me Lord Mac Binkov, according to an ancient Scottish custom. That's because I own 1 square foot of dedicated land on a private estate in Edelston, Scotland. Here's my official certificate with a crest to prove it. It comes with a unique plot number, so I can see where it is. Well, not here. There it is. In a fun and novel way, I help preserve the natural woodlands of Scotland and support global reforestation. With every order, they plant trees around the world with global charities, 1 tree planted and trees for the future. You could even officially add your title to your credit card, plane ticket or dating profile, where available. The first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will get plots next to mine and help build a Binkov realm. It makes for a great last-minute gift. Established Titles have a Black Friday sale ongoing, plus if you use the code Binkov, you'll get an additional 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/Binkov, stock up on gifts and help plant some trees. Now back to our video. On 1st of September 1939, World War II started. It could be argued that US aircraft production during the whole of 1939 did not show a meaningful rise on account of global geopolitical instability. During the said year, US produced little over 2,000 planes for the military, of which just 921 were actual combat planes. The rest were various support planes for training, transport, etc. 1940 already saw production rise as the US was helping its allies, sending them a bunch of planes. It rose by well over 200%. During almost the entire 1941, the US was still officially not at war, yet its plane production skyrocketed by over 300%. That trend continued in 1942, another 300% increase in combat planes. 1943 saw slower increases but still over 100% for combat planes. Finally, 1944 saw production peak, rising by less than 50%. Support plane production peaked even earlier, as such planes were generally not lost in combat and could be accumulated more easily. Those numbers look staggering when put into context of today's mostly peacetime US combat plane production. Now, of course, if it comes to World War III, without specifying its details, it's impossible to talk about required number of planes. But for the sake of the argument, let us assume that nuclear weapons would not get used, that economic woes would not dissuade the belligerents too much, and that indeed conflict might last for years, if not as long as World War II. Besides combat planes, US industry also produces all sorts of planes. Roughly 200 business jets are made each year, and Boeing was making 800 airliners per year until 2018. Since then, their numbers fell due to a huge backlog because their 737 MAX model could not get certified, and because of COVID, resulting in overall drop of air travel and thus plane sales. 2022 deliveries will likely be in the 300 range, but the ability to do 800 planes is likely retained by Boeing, as they expect 737 sales to continue and air travel to eventually recover. Now, combat planes are more than just the airframes. They require potent engines, advanced avionics and radars, but the US makes even more of those, because those components for other planes like Airbus ones are also largely made by US companies. For example, most of Airbus planes use either pure US engines or ones made in a joint venture with a French company. Weather radars and avionics for both Boeing and Airbus planes are made by US companies like Honeywell or Rockwell Collins. Now, a weather radar is not really meant to detect planes, but today's weather radars have come a long way. They detect water droplets out to 350 miles. They can map ground and mountains, and they are in general quite advanced. Every modern business jet or an airliner has two jet engines, which usually contain many high-technology items. Now, of course, it has to be said that an airliner engine and a weather radar can't be used in a combat plane. But those companies and their factories bring the technology base and the industrial base. They have skilled workers and a mature production process. Those companies, alongside Boeing, would be the first to make a switch to military production in case of a total war. If a world war does occur, the need for newly built airliners would plummet anyway, as the market would largely disappear. A ready-made radar and engine designs, perhaps not cutting edge, but decent enough, would be shared with such companies, so they make their own copies of them under the instructions of defense companies. Commercial marine radar companies could also help to an extent, though their technological base is sufficiently different that the numbers of marine radars made each year commercially wouldn't translate even remotely into a similar number of combat radars. Still, the base technology and the workforce would be better suited to making radars than something else. Given enough time, such companies would adapt as well and make hundreds to thousands of usable aircraft and missile radars. There's also the fact that various radars, in some ways more potent than marine radars, are already made in the thousands each year for various weapons, in air-to-air missiles, SAM missiles, strike missiles, and so on. Of course, those too would be required in war, many times over, but the point is that the industrial base is already existent, and it's quite large. What would happen right away would be all the industrial capacities making military planes meant for export being repurposed for domestic needs. With the added F-35s, F-15s and F-16s, US factories currently make around 200 fighters per year. F-35 peacetime production was once planned to size to 80 planes per year more than today, so it's a goal that's attainable with enough time and money. Money wouldn't be a problem, at least initially, but one can compress development time only to a degree. All those companies would need time to retrain their engineers and workers. New products for them would need time to get right. They would have to be tested until satisfactory. Supply chains for all the subcomponents and materials would have to expand drastically, since thousands of additional fighter radars and combat jet engines would need to be made. Currently, it takes around 2 years for a contract to materialize into a plane. Lead items and materials need to be sourced and everything needs to be assembled. It just takes time for a modern jet. That time would likely be compressed in wartime, but even such moves require learning to adapt to a new production pace. For example, the F-35 production line could add 50% more work hours almost immediately if workers would not take days off. But the supply chain could not match such a surge right away. So even just upping those existing Lockheed Martin and Boeing capacities would need easily a year and a half to produce any meaningful increase in numbers. But from then on, further increases would be more visible. Commercial and general aviation companies would start their switch right away, but they would need time to turn that switch into hundreds of planes delivered per year. So some 2 or 3 years after the start of the wartime economy, those companies would show fruits of their labor. The figures would start more than doubling in that period. The figures shown are, however, underestimated, as they don't really ramp up further. They just add the commercial company's figures, assuming one commercial plane equals one fighter plane. There's also the example of the Huey helicopter. In 1963, some 20 were made per month. As the Vietnam War heated up, production surged. 4 years later, up to 160 were made per month. Even though a Huey was not a simple machine back then, having a turbine engine and a complex transmission. And such production increase was done without a noticeable switch to wartime economy in the US. The numbers shown so far also assume top-notch quality fighters. F-35s, for example, made as are today. While some F-35s would undoubtedly remain the high-tech silver bullet weapons, it's likely we would also see poorer variants of the F-35s, F-18s, F-16s produced alongside them. Less radar-absorbing materials, simple radars and other sensors, simpler engines, and so on. Whatever is necessary to keep the air forces operational. Let us remember that a modern airliner is a very complex and sturdy plane, made of more advanced aluminium alloys and composites than jet fighters were made from in the 1970s. Not only would a lot of materials required for a single airliner result in enough materials for several jet fighters, but airliners generally use more engines. If most of today's airliner engine capacities in firms such as Pratt & Whitney, CFM and GE are used for military engines, some 3,000 engines could be made per year. That's just the repurposing, without actual expansion of the production lines. Expansions, as seen in World War II, can happen, though World War II did see much less complex planes. Even with already mentioned simplification of new wartime variants, modern planes simply take longer. For example, F-35's A production requires some 40,000 man-hours, perhaps a bit less by now. It actually compares well to F-16 production from the 1980s. Back when F-16 was super simple and when it was made in huge numbers per year, the production was super lean and quick. Later, a more complex C variant, near the end of the Cold War, was made less efficiently and took longer. So more complex stuff clearly takes longer to make. But at the same time, a well-run production line for a mature product can shave a huge chunk of the production time. The F-35's example is evident, falling to some 35% of the initial time required. Back in World War II, B-29 bomber, which was super complex for its time, saw a reduction to just 13% of its initial build time within 2 years. While F-35 production is already quite lean and it can't drop much anymore, making simpler models of US combat planes could likely yield another quarter or even a third more planes per year, as seen by the Cold War F-16 example. And crucially, all the production numbers shown so far, both for fighter jets and the airliners, involve peacetime production schedules and prices. For example, while Boeing production floors work 24 hours per weekday, on weekends they're generally on a break. Nationwide mandated wartime economy switch would mean people would work for less and there would be more workers trained. Factory floors would work 24/7. Boeing's commercial airliner division had fairly quick ramp-ups in its production when the market required it. Of course, such increases are planned in advance, but still, given that even in peacetime such large increases are possible, a total wartime economy would easily do even better. So now that nominal list from earlier would likely look more like this, with even more optimized military capacity from today, with 24/7 work schedules for every plane manufacturer, with commercial aviation makers making a few fighter jets for every airliner they made before, and with modest 35% jumps in worker numbers per year. It's possible that the fifth year of the war, in 2027, if the war starts now, could see even 10,000 combat planes made. In general, the ramp-up for today's complex planes would be a year slower than the one in World War II. Due to that and the much lower starting base, it's clear that today's figures would not really be comparable to World War II ones. The big difference is that in World War II, commercial planes did not make up such a huge majority of overall plane production. It is precisely the US advantage in commercial use airplanes that would allow the US to ramp up to such figures at all. It could be argued that if a ramp up in ships would be required, the US would fare much worse in increased percentages. The commercial shipbuilding industry base in the US is simply not so much bigger than the military one, compared to the way the commercial aviation industry base is bigger than the military one. So could World War II numbers be achieved? 70,000 combat planes made in a year? No. But could a somewhat similar increase percentage-wise be achieved? That's quite possible. Of course, and this is important, warfare today is not the same as warfare in the 1940s. Just because the US could eventually build thousands of combat planes per year doesn't mean it would. Perhaps a better use of resources would be building a smaller number but investing the remaining resources into more guided weapons, unmanned sensor platforms, and so on. But if the situation is such that a long world war does occur, massive numbers are possible. Not on World War II scale, but figures even an order of magnitude smaller are still impressive, likely not matched by any other industrial power in the world, at least when it comes to aircraft.